The night began like so many others, with soft golden lights falling across white tablecloths, champagne glasses reflecting tiny fragments of conversations, laughter rising and falling in waves across the elegant ballroom where everyone seemed perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly aligned with the roles they had rehearsed for years. And Carmen stood near the entrance wearing a navy silk dress that had taken her 3 hours to choose, not because she cared about impressing anyone. But because she needed armor, she needed something that made her feel like she still existed, like she still mattered in a marriage that had slowly, methodically, almost invisibly erased her over the course of 15 years, and when she saw him arrive, her husband Daniel. Walking through those glass doors with his hand resting on the lower back of a woman Carmen had never seen before, a young woman with glossy dark hair and a confident smile, a woman who looked at Daniel the way Carmen used to look at him 2 decades ago, something inside her chest didn't shatter. It didn't explode, instead it quietly solidified, turned into something cold and clear and unbreakable, because this was the moment she had been preparing for without even knowing it. The moment when all the tiny humiliations, all the dismissive comments, all the nights he came home late smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, all of it coalesced into a single crystalline understanding that she would never again be the woman who pretended not to see. The human brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, has an extraordinary capacity for denial, for constructing elaborate narratives that protect us from truths too painful to acknowledge immediately. And for years, Carmen's brain had been doing exactly that, building walls of rationalization around every suspicious detail, every unexplained absence, every moment when Daniel's attention drifted away from her mid-sentence, as though she had become background noise in her own marriage. But tonight those walls came down not with violence, but with a strange sense of relief. Because the worst thing you can imagine is often less terrible than the energy required to keep imagining it might not be true. And as she watched Daniel introduce this woman to his colleagues, watched him laugh at something she whispered in his ear, watched the ease and intimacy between them that spoke of months, maybe years of connection, Carmen felt her nervous system shift from chronic anxiety into something else entirely. A state neuroscientists call coherent rage, where the amygdala stops sending out panic distress signals and instead channels all that energy into focused, calculated clarity. She didn't approach them immediately. Instead, she moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, because this party was ostensibly about Daniel's latest business triumph, a merger he had been orchestrating for 18 months, the kind of deal that would cement his reputation and expand his empire. And everyone wanted to celebrate him, to be near his success, to feel the warmth of his winning, but Carmen understood something they didn't. She understood that empires built on betrayal have foundations made of sand, and she had spent the last 6 months not confronting him, not pleading with him, not even letting him know she suspected anything. Instead, she had been quietly, methodically gathering information, because her father had taught her something crucial before he died. He had told her that knowledge is the only currency that never devalues, and she had taken that lesson into every corner of Daniel's professional life. Learning the names of his business partners, understanding the structure of his deals, memorizing the details of contracts she wasn't supposed to see. Carmen thought back to the woman she had been at 23. The girl who had fallen in love with Daniel's ambition and his certainty. The way he seemed to know exactly where he was going while she was still figuring out who she wanted to be. And she remembered how safe that had felt, how comforting it was to attach herself to someone with such clear direction. But what she hadn't understood then, what takes most women years or even decades to recognize, is that men who need to dominate every room they enter, men who speak over others and make decisions without consultation, men who view relationships as territories to conquer rather than partnerships to nurture. These men don't suddenly become different behind closed doors. They don't transform into gentle equals when the audience disappears. Instead, they simply find more subtle ways to maintain control. And over 15 years, Daniel had systematically diminished her opinions, dismissed her concerns, made her feel foolish for questioning him, until she had almost forgotten that she once had a voice that didn't apologize before speaking. The woman standing beside Daniel was young, perhaps 28 or 29, with the kind of polished confidence that comes from not yet having been broken by life. And Carmen felt a complicated wave of emotion watching her, not jealousy exactly, but something closer to grief for who this woman would become if she continued down this path, because Carmen could see the future stretching ahead, could see how Daniel would eventually tire of her too, how the excitement would fade into routine, how he would start arriving home later and later, how this woman would find herself at a party years from now watching him introduce yet another younger woman to his colleagues. But right now she was glowing with the belief that she was special, that their connection was different, that he had never felt this way about anyone else. And Carmen knew these lies intimately because she had once believed them herself. When Carmen finally approached, she did so with a smile that showed all her teeth but reached nowhere near her eyes. And she extended her hand to the young woman, saying in a voice that carried just enough warmth to sound genuine to everyone listening, "It's wonderful to meet you. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Carmen, Daniel's wife," and she watched the color drain from the woman's face, watched her eyes dart to Daniel seeking instruction or reassurance, watched the confidence crumble into confusion and fear. And Daniel, to his credit, recovered quickly, his lawyer's training kicking in as he smoothly improvised something about this being his new executive assistant, someone crucial to the merger, someone who absolutely had to be here tonight to celebrate this achievement. And Carmen let him talk, let him construct his flimsy explanation, because she understood that rope given freely is rope a man will use to hang himself. The evening continued with a surreal quality, conversations happening around her while she moved through some alternative reality where she could see everything with perfect clarity. The other executives and their wives performing their own versions of marital theater. The forced laughter and careful touches that spoke of relationships held together by shared investments rather than shared affection. And she wondered how many of these women knew, how many had made the same calculations she was making tonight. How many had decided that security was worth the price of dignity, because that was the bargain, wasn't it? The unspoken contract that women of her generation had been taught to accept. You could have the house and the lifestyle and the social status. All you had to surrender was the expectation of fidelity, of respect, of being seen as fully human rather than as a supporting character in your husband's narrative. But Carmen had spent the last 6 months learning something Daniel had forgotten, or perhaps had never known, which was that she wasn't just a wife. She wasn't just the woman who managed his household and raised their daughter and appeared beside him at events wearing the right dress and saying the right things. She was also the daughter of a man who had built his own empire in commercial real estate. And though her father was gone, his colleagues remembered her. His network was still accessible to her. And she had used that access carefully, strategically, making phone calls that seemed innocent, asking questions that appeared casual, until she had assembled a comprehensive understanding of Daniel's business dealings, including the parts he didn't advertise publicly. The merger Daniel was celebrating tonight, the deal that would supposedly triple the value of his company, was built on a series of strategic misrepresentations that walked right up to the edge of legality and occasionally stepped over it. Carmen had discovered contracts that promised things Daniel couldn't deliver, projections that inflated asset values, emails that showed him knowingly concealing problems from potential investors, and most importantly, she had found evidence of a shell company he had created to move money in ways that would deeply concern both his business partners and the Securities and Exchange Commission. None of it was accidental, none of it was oversight. It was systematic fraud dressed up in expensive legal language. And Daniel had assumed he was clever enough to hide it, had assumed that nobody was paying close enough attention, had certainly never imagined that his wife, the woman he dismissed and ignored and betrayed, would be the one to unravel everything. Carmen excused herself from another tedious conversation about real estate markets and made her way to the ladies' room, where she locked herself in a stall and pulled out her phone, her hands completely steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. Because this wasn't a decision made in anger, this wasn't revenge born from tonight's humiliation. This was justice that had been building for years. For every time he made her feel small, for every decision he made without consulting her. For every night he lied about where he had been, for every moment he treated their marriage like an inconvenient obligation rather than a sacred commitment. And most of all, for their daughter Sophia, who is 16 now and watching her parents' marriage, learning from Carmen's example what women should tolerate, what love should look like, and Carmen refused to teach her daughter that this was acceptable. She composed an email to the lead investor in Daniel's merger, a man named Richard Chen who she had met twice at corporate events, a man who valued integrity above all else and who had built his fortune on careful due diligence. And she attached documents she had copied from Daniel's home office, spreadsheets that showed the real numbers behind his projections, emails that revealed his awareness of significant problems with the properties involved in the deal, and a detailed summary of the shell company structure written in language clear enough that even someone without forensic accounting expertise could understand what they were looking at. Then she copied the email to 3 other major investors, to Daniel's primary business partner, and to a contact she had cultivated at the SEC, someone who had assured her that if credible evidence of fraud crossed his desk, he was obligated to investigate. Before she hit send, Carmen allowed herself one moment of hesitation, one final opportunity to reconsider, because she understood that pressing that button would destroy everything Daniel had built, would likely result in criminal charges, would certainly mean financial ruin and social disgrace. And their daughter would have to navigate the aftermath, would have to tell her friends why her father was in the news, why they had to sell the house, why everything had changed. But Carmen also knew that teaching Sophia to stand up for herself, to refuse to be diminished, to understand that no amount of money or status was worth abandoning your dignity, that lesson was worth any temporary difficulty, that lesson would shape the woman Sophia would become. And so Carmen pressed send and listened to the soft whoosh of the email departing, carrying with it the dissolution of her husband's empire. She returned to the party and found Daniel holding court near the bar, the young mistress nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had left, perhaps she was hiding. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that being the other woman isn't actually a position of power, it's just another form of being used. And Carmen approached her husband with a champagne flute in her hand. And when he smiled at her, that automatic smile he deployed in public, she leaned in close and whispered so only he could hear. I know everything, Daniel. I know about the fraud, I know about the shell companies, and I just sent everything to your investors and to the SEC. Your empire is over. And she watched his face transform, watched the smile freeze and crack, watched panic flood into his eyes. And for the first time in 15 years, she saw him truly see her, recognize her as someone with agency and power, someone capable of destroying him. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to leave a mark, but with enough force that she knew he wanted to hurt her, wanted to intimidate her, and he hissed, "You can't do this, Carmen. Do you understand what you've done? You've destroyed our life, our daughter's future, everything we built." And she pulled her arm free and said in a voice that didn't shake, "No, Daniel, I destroyed what you built on lies. I destroyed the life you were living with another woman while pretending to be married to me. I destroyed the illusion that I would keep participating in my own erasure. What I built, what I actually contributed to this marriage, that was real, and it will survive whatever comes next." And she turned and walked away from him, walked out of the ballroom where people were still laughing and drinking and celebrating, walked out into the cool night air where she could finally breathe. The neuroscience of betrayal is more complex than most people realize. When someone we love and trust betrays us, it doesn't just hurt emotionally. It actually disrupts the brain's ability to predict and make sense of the world, the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps us navigate social relationships and anticipate others' behavior, essentially short circuits. And the result is a kind of cognitive dissonance where we know what happened, but we can't quite believe it. Can't integrate it into our understanding of reality. And this is why women like Carmen often stay in marriages long after the betrayal becomes obvious, not because they're weak or foolish, but because their brains are trying desperately to reconcile the person they loved with the person who hurt them, trying to find a way to make the story make sense. But eventually, sometimes after years, the brain adapts, it creates a new framework for understanding. And this is when women stop making excuses. Stop trying to fix what is fundamentally broken and start taking action. Carmen drove home that night along familiar streets, passing houses where other families were presumably living their own versions of normal. And she thought about all the women who had come before her. Her mother who had stayed in a loveless marriage for 40 years. Her grandmother who had endured worse. Generations of women who had been taught that their value was tied to their ability to maintain a family structure regardless of the personal cost. But something had shifted in the world, slowly, imperfectly. But undeniably, women were beginning to understand that they didn't have to accept betrayal as the price of security, that being alone was better than being diminished, that their children would be better off seeing a mother who respected herself than seeing a mother who modeled submission. And Carmen felt a profound connection to all those women who had made similar choices, who had blown up their lives in service of something more important than comfort. She arrived home to find Sophia still awake, sitting in the kitchen with homework spread across the table, and her daughter looked up with a smile that faded when she saw Carmen's face. And she asked, "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" And Carmen sat down across from her and said, "Something happened tonight that's going to change things. Your father has been lying to us about many things, and I've taken action that means our life is going to look very different soon. We might have to move, money will be tight. People will talk, but I need you to understand that I did this because I love you, because I want you to grow up knowing that you never have to tolerate being treated as less than you are, that you never have to stay somewhere that makes you small." And she watched her daughter's face process this information, watched fear and confusion shift into something else. Something that looked almost like relief. Sophia said, "I knew something was wrong, I could feel it. The way he talks to you, the way you've been different lately, sad but also kind of stronger. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't okay." And Carmen felt tears finally come, not from sadness but from a fierce protective love, because her daughter had been watching, had been absorbing the dynamics of their household, had been learning from Carmen's example. And if Carmen had continued to accept Daniel's treatment, continued to pretend everything was fine, Sophia would have learned that love looks like betrayal, that marriage means accepting disrespect, that women's feelings don't matter as much as maintaining appearances. But now Sophia would learn something different. She would learn that women can be powerful, that actions have consequences, that dignity is worth fighting for. The next 3 days unfolded with the kind of chaos Carmen had anticipated. Richard Chen called her the morning after the party, his voice carefully controlled, thanking her for the information and asking if she would be available to answer questions. And she said yes, scheduled a meeting, prepared herself to walk through everything she knew. And by that afternoon the merger was suspended, investors were pulling out. Daniel's business partner was threatening legal action. The SEC had opened an investigation. Daniel didn't come home that first night or the second. And when he finally appeared on the third day, it was with his lawyer attempting to negotiate, to minimize the damage, to somehow convince Carmen to recant, to claim she had been mistaken or emotional or vindictive. But she sat in her own living room, in the house she had maintained and filled with life while he was busy building empires and betraying her trust, and she said simply, "I told the truth, Daniel. Everything I sent was accurate, everything I said was real. You can't negotiate away reality." The legal proceedings that followed were complicated and exhausting. Depositions and document reviews and lawyers explaining things in language designed to obscure rather than clarify. But Carmen moved through it with a clarity that surprised even her, because she had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning her perceptions, wondering if she was overreacting or being too sensitive. And now she had documentary evidence that proved she had been right all along, that her instincts had been correct. That the problem wasn't her inability to trust, it was his unworthiness of trust. And this validation, while it didn't erase the pain, provided a foundation of certainty she could stand on while everything else crumbled. Daniel was eventually charged with securities fraud and conspiracy, charges that carried significant prison time if he was convicted. And the business he had spent 20 years building was liquidated to pay back defrauded investors. And the house Carmen had loved, where she had raised Sophia and hosted holidays and created a life, that had to be sold too because it had been purchased with money that legally belonged to others. And she and Sophia moved into a small apartment in a less prestigious neighborhood. And Sophia's private school became a public school, and the country club membership lapsed, and all the material markers of the life Carmen had known disappeared. But something unexpected happened in the midst of this loss. She discovered that she was okay, more than okay, she was free. Without Daniel's constant criticism, without the need to monitor his moods and manage his ego and pretend not to notice his betrayals, Carmen found that she had energy for things she had forgot she enjoyed. She started painting again, something she had loved in college but abandoned because Daniel dismissed it as impractical. She joined a book club and discovered the pleasure of conversations where she wasn't interrupted or corrected. She took Sophia on walks where they talked about everything and nothing. Building a relationship based on honesty rather than the careful omissions Carmen had practiced for years. And slowly, in ways she couldn't have predicted when she sent that email, she began to recognize someone in the mirror, a woman she had almost forgotten existed, the woman she had been before she learned to make herself smaller. The neuroscience of recovery from betrayal trauma involves the gradual rebuilding of trust in one's own perceptions. When we've been gaslit or manipulated, when someone we love has consistently denied our reality, our brain's ability to trust its own judgment becomes compromised. The hippocampus, which helps form and retrieve memories, can actually show changes in people who have experienced this kind of psychological abuse, making it harder to distinguish between what really happened and what they've been told happened. But with time and distance from the source of manipulation, with validation from others that our perceptions were accurate, the brain can heal, neural pathways can reorganize, and we can learn to trust ourselves again. This is what was happening for Carmen in those months after Daniel's arrest. Her brain was quite literally rewiring itself, building new patterns of thought that didn't require his approval or validation. She started therapy, something she had suggested to Daniel years ago when their marriage first showed cracks, but he had refused, had said they didn't need outside help, that their problems were private, that suggesting therapy meant Carmen thought there was something fundamentally wrong with him. And she had accepted this, had tried to fix things alone. But now she sat in a small office with a woman named Dr. Patricia Morrison, and she told the truth, all of it. The years of dismissiveness and the betrayals and the slow erosion of her sense of self. And Dr. Morrison listened without judgment and asked questions that helped Carmen see patterns she hadn't recognized, helped her understand that what she had experienced wasn't just a bad marriage, it was a systematic pattern of coercive control dressed up in expensive suits and social respectability. Dr. Morrison explained that men like Daniel often choose partners with certain characteristics. Women who are empathetic and accommodating, women who were raised to prioritize others' needs, women who believe that love means sacrifice because these women can be more easily manipulated, more readily convinced that relationship problems are their fault, more willing to keep trying to fix things. And Carmen recognized herself in this description, remembered her mother teaching her to be the peacemaker, to smooth over conflicts, to make others comfortable even at the expense of her own comfort. And she understood that these weren't bad qualities exactly. Empathy and accommodation and the desire for peace were valuable, but they became dangerous when extended to someone who exploited them, who weaponized her kindness against her. There were setbacks, nights when Carmen lay awake calculating how much money they had left, how she would support herself and Sophia if she couldn't find work after years away from any career. Moments when the weight of what she had done felt crushing, when she wondered if she should have just stayed silent, just tolerated the betrayal, just accepted that this was how marriage worked for women like her. But then she would remember the look on Daniel's face when he introduced his mistress at the party. The casual cruelty of it, the certainty that Carmen would absorb this humiliation without consequence, and her resolve would harden again, because even in her darkest moments she knew that teaching Sophia to accept such treatment would have been a greater betrayal than anything Daniel had done. Sophia thrived in ways that surprised both of them. The new school challenged her differently. The smaller apartment meant they spent more time together. The absence of Daniel's volatile presence meant they could both exhale, and one evening Sophia said something that Carmen would remember for the rest of her life. She said, "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know this has been hard. I know you did it partly for me, and I want you to know that I see you. I see how strong you are. How brave you were to blow everything up rather than keep pretending, and I hope I'm like you when I grow up. I hope I'm someone who won't accept being treated badly even when it would be easier to just stay quiet." And Carmen held her daughter and cried, not from sadness but from a profound sense that despite everything they had lost, they had gained something infinitely more valuable. Carmen eventually found work at a nonprofit organization that helped women leaving abusive relationships, and there was a certain poetry to this. A woman who had left her own form of abuse now helping others do the same. And she discovered that she was good at this work, that her experience made her credible, that she could look women in the eye and say, "I know how hard this is, I know how much you're giving up, I know people think you're crazy for leaving, but I also know that you will survive this. That you will discover parts of yourself you forgot existed, that your children will benefit from seeing you choose dignity over security." And she meant it, every word, because she was living proof that it was possible. She began speaking at events, telling her story to rooms full of women who were trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether to confront or accept, whether to believe their instincts or the explanations they'd been given. And she would describe that night at the party, the moment Daniel walked in with his mistress, the phone call that destroyed his empire, and women would approach her afterward with tears in their eyes saying, "Thank you, I needed to hear that, I've been making excuses for years. I thought I was crazy, I thought I was the problem, but hearing your story helped me understand that I deserve better." And Carmen would hold their hands and say, "You do deserve better, you deserve someone who sees you, who respects you, who treats your heart like the precious thing it is. And if that person doesn't exist in your life right now, it's better to be alone than to be with someone who makes you feel alone." 2 years after that party, Daniel was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, reduced from the potential 12 he faced because he cooperated with prosecutors and agreed to testify against others involved in the scheme. And Carmen attended the sentencing, sat in the courtroom and listened to him make a statement about how sorry he was, how he had lost his way, how he hoped his family could forgive him. And she felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindictiveness. No lingering love or resentment, just a kind of distant observation, as though she were watching a stranger because the man she had loved didn't exist, had never existed, had been a fiction she created to explain the inexplicable. And this man being led away in handcuffs was simply a person who had made choices that harmed others, including her, and now he was facing consequences. She thought about the young mistress sometimes, wondered where she had ended up, whether she had learned anything from the experience or whether she was repeating the pattern with another powerful man. And Carmen felt a complicated sympathy for her, because she understood that the real tragedy wasn't being the wife who got betrayed. It was spending your life believing that your value comes from being chosen by powerful men, that being the exception, being special enough to make them leave their wives, was some kind of victory, when in reality it was just the continuation of a cycle that diminished everyone involved. Carmen started writing, at first just journal entries processing her experience, but gradually those entries became essays and then a book proposal and eventually a published memoir titled The Phone Call. And it sold modestly but steadily, and she received letters from women all over the country, women who had stayed too long, women who were planning their exits, women who had already left and needed validation that they had made the right choice. And Carmen read every letter and answered as many as she could, because she understood that healing from betrayal trauma required community, required knowing you weren't alone, required hearing from other women that they had survived and you would too. Sophia went to college on a scholarship, studying psychology because she said she wanted to understand people, wanted to help others the way her mother had, and Carmen watched her daughter walk across campus for the first time and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not because Sophia was at a prestigious school or because she was studying something lucrative, but because she was confident, because she was clear about her boundaries. Because she had grown up watching Carmen refuse to accept being diminished and had learned that lesson deeply. On the 5-year anniversary of that party, Carmen took herself to dinner at a nice restaurant, ordered good wine, toasted silently to the woman she had become, the woman who had found the courage to destroy her life in order to save herself. And she thought about how neuroscience tells us that the brain remains plastic throughout our lives, that we can always create new neural pathways, learn new patterns, become different versions of ourselves, and she had proven this. Had literally rewired her brain from someone who accommodated abuse to someone who refused it, from someone who doubted her perceptions to someone who trusted them absolutely, from someone who believed her value came from being chosen to someone who understood her value was inherent. She still had moments of difficulty, money remained tight, dating felt impossibly complicated after everything she had been through. She sometimes felt lonely in ways that surprised her. But she also had moments of profound joy, quiet evenings reading with a glass of wine, long conversations with Sophia, work that felt meaningful, friendships based on authenticity rather than social positioning. and increasingly she understood that this was what she had been searching for all along. Not a perfect life, but a real one, not a marriage that looked good from the outside, but an existence that felt aligned with who she actually was. Other women from her former social circle occasionally reached out, usually tentatively, usually starting with some version of, "I heard what happened, I'm sorry things turned out that way," as though Carmen's choice to expose fraud and leave a betrayer was some kind of tragedy. And Carmen learned to respond graciously but firmly, learned to say, "I'm not sorry, this was the best decision I ever made. I have less money and more freedom, fewer possessions and more self-respect. And I would make the same choice again without hesitation," and usually these women would pause, would perhaps see something in Carmen's face that made them question their own accommodations, their own calculations about what they were willing to tolerate for security. The neuroscience of transformation, the actual biological process by which we change, involves something called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and strengthen new pathways while allowing unused ones to weaken. And this process requires consistent practice, requires repeatedly choosing new behaviors even when old patterns feel more comfortable, requires consciously directing attention toward the person you want to become rather than the person you've been. And Carmen had done this work day after day, choosing to trust her instincts, choosing to speak her truth, choosing to prioritize her dignity over others' comfort, until these choices became automatic, became her new default way of being in the world. She started dating eventually, tentatively, men who seemed kind and steady, and she discovered that she had different criteria now. She was less interested in ambition and confidence and more interested in empathy and consistency. She found herself drawn to men who asked questions and listened to answers, who respected her opinions even when they disagreed, who saw her as an equal rather than an acquisition, and when she encountered men who reminded her even slightly of Daniel. Men who talked over her or dismissed her concerns or expected her to accommodate them without reciprocity. She ended things immediately without guilt, without the sense that she should try harder, because she had learned that the early warning signs were never wrong, that if someone showed you who they were you should believe them, that you couldn't love someone into respecting you. On Sophia's 21st birthday, they had dinner together at the apartment they still shared, now decorated with art Carmen had painted and photographs from trips they had taken on tight budgets, making memories that felt richer than any of the expensive vacations from Carmen's previous life. And Sophia raised her glass and said, "I want to thank you for showing me what it looks like to choose yourself, for teaching me that women don't have to accept crumbs. That we can flip the table over and walk out when we're not being treated right. And I know it wasn't easy, I know you sacrificed a lot, but I want you to know that I see it, I appreciate it. And I will never settle for less than I deserve because you taught me that I'm worth more." And Carmen felt a wave of emotion so powerful she could barely speak. Because this was why she had done it. This was the point of all the struggle and sacrifice, Sophia's strength, Sophia's clarity. Sophia's absolute certainty that she deserved respect. Carmen continued her work helping other women, and she noticed patterns, noticed that the women who successfully left and rebuilt their lives shared certain characteristics. They had reached a point where the pain of staying exceeded the fear of leaving. They had some form of support system even if small. They had begun to trust their own perceptions again. And most importantly, they had stopped waiting for their partners to change and started focusing on changing themselves, changing their responses, changing their tolerance, changing their vision of what was possible. She also noticed that many women experienced what she had experienced, a kind of grief not just for the relationship that ended, but for the version of themselves they had been in that relationship. The accommodating woman, the understanding wife, the eternal optimist who believed love could overcome anything. And Carmen would tell them it's okay to grieve her, that woman served a purpose. She kept you safe when safety required accommodation, but she's not who you need to be anymore. Now you need to be someone who sets boundaries, who trusts her instincts, who refuses to diminish herself, and this new woman, she's not worse than the old one, she's not harder or colder or less loving, she's just wiser. She's learned that real love doesn't require you to disappear. 10 years after the party, Carmen received a letter from Daniel, written from prison where he was serving out his final year. And in it he apologized, not the performative apology he had made at sentencing, but something that seemed genuine. Something that acknowledged the specific ways he had hurt her, the years of dismissiveness and betrayal, the systematic erosion of her sense of self, and he wrote, "I know this doesn't change anything, I know I destroyed what we had. But I need you to know that I see now what I couldn't see then, that you were right to do what you did, that I was becoming someone monstrous and you stopped me. And while I've lost everything, I've also gained something. I've gained the ability to see myself clearly, to understand the harm I caused, and if nothing else comes from this nightmare, at least there's that." Carmen read the letter multiple times, trying to discern whether this was manipulation or genuine remorse, and eventually she decided it didn't matter whether Daniel had truly changed or was simply better at performing. Change was irrelevant to her life now. She didn't need his apology to validate her choice, didn't need his acknowledgement to know she had been right. She had moved beyond the point where his opinion held any weight, and so she wrote back a brief note saying, "I appreciate you writing. I hope you've learned from this experience. I wish you well in whatever comes next, but I've moved on. My life is full and meaningful without you in it, and I don't want or need ongoing contact." And she meant it, not cruelly, but simply as a statement of fact. She thought about writing a second book, something about recovery and rebuilding, about the science of neuroplasticity and transformation, about the practical steps women could take to recreate their lives after betrayal. But for now, she was content with her speaking engagements and her nonprofit work, with the individual women she helped and the small but meaningful impact she was making. And she had learned something important about ambition, that it didn't always have to mean empire building. Sometimes it just meant showing up consistently for work that mattered, touching individual lives, creating ripples that might eventually become waves. Carmen was dating someone now, a man named Marcus who taught high school English and wrote poetry and had been through his own journey of leaving a toxic marriage. And what she appreciated most about him was his consistency. The way he showed up when he said he would, the way he listened without trying to fix things, the way he respected her need for independence even as they built something together. And she found that she could be vulnerable with him in ways she never could with Daniel, could admit uncertainty, could ask for help, could take up space without worrying that she was being too much. And this felt revolutionary, this simple experience of being loved for who she actually was rather than who she pretended to be. The inner child work Carmen did in therapy helped her understand that her tendency to accommodate, to prioritize others' needs, to make herself small, all of this traced back to childhood dynamics where love felt conditional, where she learned that being good meant being convenient, where conflict was dangerous and needed to be avoided at all costs. And understanding this didn't erase the patterns, but it helped her recognize them. Helped her catch herself when she started to slip into old behaviors, helped her choose differently, and she worked on giving that younger version of herself, that little girl who learned to shrink, permission to take up space now, permission to be loud and messy and demanding when necessary, permission to prioritize her own needs without guilt. She understood now that the phone call she made that night, the email that destroyed Daniel's empire, wasn't revenge. It was the first moment in 15 years that she had chosen herself, had said through action rather than words that her dignity mattered more than her comfort, that truth mattered more than appearances, that she would rather lose everything than continue participating in her own erasure. And this choice had reverberated through every area of her life. Had taught her that she was capable of surviving anything, that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that she could trust herself to handle whatever came next. Sophia was thriving now, working at a crisis center helping teenagers, and she would sometimes call Carmen to talk through difficult cases. And Carmen would listen and offer what she knew, and she felt a deep satisfaction knowing that her daughter had taken the lessons of their shared trauma and transformed them into service, had chosen a career where she could help others who were struggling, where her own experience of watching her mother choose dignity over security had given her credibility and compassion. And Carmen understood that this was how generational patterns changed, not through perfection but through the willingness to do better, to choose differently, to break cycles even when breaking them was terrifying. The apartment where Carmen and Sophia had lived for so long, the small space that had represented loss when they first moved in, had become home in ways their previous house never was. It was full of laughter and honest conversations and art that meant something to them. And when Sophia eventually moved out to live with her partner, Carmen stayed, because she had learned that home wasn't about square footage or prestige. It was about feeling safe enough to be yourself. And she felt safer in this small apartment than she ever had in the mansion she shared with Daniel. Carmen painted now almost every day. Large canvases full of color and movement that expressed things she didn't have words for, the complexity of trauma and healing, the strange coexistence of grief and relief, the journey from being someone who needed permission to being someone who gave herself permission. And some of her work was displayed in local galleries, and people would stand in front of her paintings and ask what they meant, and Carmen would say, "They mean whatever you need them to mean. Art isn't about my intention, it's about your experience." And this felt true about life too, about the story of what she had done and why. Different people drew different lessons. Some saw her as vindictive, some as heroic, some as cautionary tale, but what mattered was that she knew her own truth, knew why she had made the choices she made, and she was at peace with them. The work Carmen did with survivors taught her that healing wasn't linear, that you could have months of feeling strong and then one smell or one song or one random Tuesday could bring everything back, the fear and the self-doubt and the grief. But she also learned that these setbacks didn't erase progress, that you could feel all those feelings and still trust yourself, still know that you had made the right choice, still move forward into whatever came next. And she tried to communicate this to the women she worked with. Tried to help them understand that healing looked messy, that it involved 2 steps forward and 1 step back, that there would be moments when they questioned everything, but that on the other side of that questioning was a deeper certainty, a more solid foundation. Carmen thought sometimes about the alternate timeline, the life she would be living if she hadn't sent that email, if she had just accepted Daniel's betrayal and stayed. And she imagined that version of herself growing older in that beautiful house, wearing expensive clothes, attending the right parties, maintaining appearances, slowly disappearing until there was nothing left but a perfectly styled shell, and she felt profound gratitude that she had chosen differently. That she had found the courage to blow everything up even when she couldn't see what would be built in the ruins, because what she had built was a life that was hers, authentically and completely hers, and no amount of money or status or security could compare to that. On the 15th anniversary of the night that changed everything, Carmen returned to the hotel where the party had been held, walked into that same ballroom now hosting someone else's celebration. And she stood in the spot where she had first seen Daniel with his mistress, where her entire world had clarified in an instant. And she felt nothing but gratitude, gratitude for the clarity that moment had given her, gratitude for the strength she hadn't known she possessed. Gratitude for every painful step of the journey that had led her to become the woman she was now. Someone who trusted herself absolutely, someone who refused to be diminished, someone who knew that the only empire worth building was the internal one, the fortress of self-respect and dignity that no one could take from you because you had claimed it yourself. And as she walked out of that ballroom into the evening light, Carmen felt complete, felt whole, felt like she was finally fully exactly who she was always meant to be.